The strength of the British system of government has been its ability to stifle any danger of revolution through reform. During the 19th century, Britain's government was the model most liberals throughout Europe sought to copy. It was a constitutional monarchy where the power of the monarch was greatly restricted by Parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. As the 19th century progressed, this system developed into one of the most democratic in Europe. The politics of the country was dominated by two parties: the Conservatives, Tories, and the Liberals, Whigs. By 1870 it was the most industrialized and the most powerful country in the world. It possessed the world's largest empire protected by a very formidable navy. Imperialism was popular, and during this period Britain added to her colonial possessions. They included India, the jewel in the crown, South Africa, Canada, Australia, Malaya, now Malaysia, Egypt, Nigeria, and Rhodesia, and covered 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. However, the Industrial Revolution had created severe social problems, as Britain became the world's most urbanized country. Over half of her population lived in cities. The social problems were to be found especially in the area of housing, education and health care. The major measures of reform can be grouped into 4 categories. Parliamentary reform, workers' rights, education, social welfare. A series of acts had gradually extended the franchise in England during this period. These were passed by both parties and helped to strengthen support for the political system in Britain. The 1832 Reform Act had given the vote to the middle classes. The 1867 Reform Act gave the vote to every male adult householder living in the towns. Male lodgers paying £10 were also granted the vote. The Act gave the vote to about 1,500,000 men. In effect, the Act had given the vote to the working classes in the towns. Several industrial towns that were previously unrepresented were given MPs. A Conservative government led by Benjamin Disraeli had introduced this measure with the support of the Liberals. Pause. 2. The 1872 Secret Ballot Act made voting secret and greatly reduced the power of landlords in determining the outcome of elections. The 1884 Reform Act gave the vote to the poor farmers and laborers in the countryside and greatly reorganized electoral areas to reflect the move in population from the countryside to the larger towns. This act tripled the electorate and established the principle of one man, one vote, males over 25. Another major item of parliamentary reform was the Parliament Act of 1911. It ended the veto of the House of Lords and only allowed it to delay bills for 2 years. MPs were also paid for the first time under this act. The major issue left untouched was that of votes for women. In 1903, the Women's Social and Political Union was founded by Emmeline Pankhurst and had 2 daughters to demand the vote for women. Until 1914, when the First World War broke out, they campaigned energetically, and sometimes violently, to achieve this aim. In 1906, the Daily Mail first referred to members of the WSPU as suffragettes. This name became widely used by both supporters and opponents of the campaign. Suffragettes were responsible for breaking the windows of 10 Downing Street, burning buildings and damaging paintings in public galleries. They were often prepared to go to prison for their cause or even put their own lives in danger. While in prison, they went on hunger strike. The government often force-fed the women prisoners. The so-called Cat and Mouse Act was passed by the government in an attempt to prevent suffragettes from obtaining public sympathy. It provided for releasing those whose condition got too serious, then re-imprisoning them when they had recovered. In 1913, the suffragette Emily Davison tried to stop the Derby horse race by running onto the track just as the horses came round Tattenham Corner. In many texts, you will read that she threw herself under King George V's horse, which is simply not true. She died from her injuries. When World War I broke out, many women took jobs normally undertaken by men. The huge numbers of men needed to fight the war resulted in women being employed as gas workers, coal heavers, transport workers, and ambulance drivers. When the war ended, the tremendous war effort of these female workers was rewarded by the introduction of a bill that allowed women over 30 years to vote in parliamentary elections. Trade unions for skilled workers had grown in strength throughout the 19th century and were made legal in 1871 and given the right to strike. In 1875 they were permitted to peacefully picket their place of work when on strike, Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act. Unions for unskilled workers were slow to develop. Throughout the 1880s there were a series of strikes by unskilled workers in an attempt to improve their conditions. The most famous of these were the Match Girls' Strike of 1888 and the Dockers' Strike of 1889, both of which were successful. However, the trade union movement suffered a severe setback with Taff Vale case in 1901. A union was found to be financially liable for the losses that the Taff Vale Railway Company suffered during a strike. The Conservative government took no action. The Liberal government, 1906, brought in the Trade Disputes Act, 1906, which declared that unions could not be sued for damages incurred during a strike. This reversed the Taff Vale judgment. Trade unions began to sponsor candidates for Parliament. In 1900 the Labour Representation Committee was formed. In 1906 it changed its name to the Labour Party and was led by Keir Hardie. 29 MPs were elected in the election of that year. The Labour Party continued to grow and in the 1920s replaced the Liberals as one of the two big parties in England. The provision of education in England was improved greatly by a series of laws that made a basic education available to all children. The 1870 Education Act, commonly named after its author W.E. Forster, set up school districts. Local ratepayers were asked to build a primary school in an area where one did not already exist. The local board had the right to compel children to attend these schools and to charge a nominal fee. 1874 Over 5,000 new schools had been founded. In 1880 education became compulsory up to the age of 10, raised to 12 in 1899, and in 1891 it was made free. However, the absence of real reform in the secondary sector meant that education in 1900 was generally only up to primary level. Britain lagged seriously behind Germany and France. In 1902 the Education Act, Balfour Act, greatly improved this situation. It provided for the funding of secondary schools out of local rates with helps of grants from central government. In 1907 a scholarship scheme made it possible for the clever children from poor backgrounds to attend secondary school. By 1914 Britain had a well-organized system of education. The Industrial Revolution and the growth of the towns had created a number of serious social and health problems. A number of measures were brought in to alleviate the conditions of ordinary people. The Public Health Act of 1872 set up health authorities throughout England. However, the operation of the Act was seriously hampered by a lack of money. A further Act in 1875 increased funding and greatly improved the situation. It also brought together a range of acts covering sewerage and drains, water supply, housing and disease. Other legislation in this period included the Artisans Dwelling Act, 1875, which allowed for a large clearance of slums in England. In 1888 local government was introduced to England, and this was further improved upon in 1894. Throughout the 19th century a series of factory acts had regulated conditions for workers in factories. By the 1870s workers in Britain had a half-day on Saturday, and this led to the growth of organised sports, especially soccer. The long period of Conservative government between 1895 and 1905 had meant a slowing of reform. In 1900 it was estimated that 30% of the population lived on the edge of starvation. There were also great inequalities of income and wealth. A working-class family lived on about 18 shillings a week while a middle-class family spent £10. During the Boer War the medical condition of the working-class recruits was a cause of grave concern, and more attempts were made to improve the nation's health. In 1906 a Liberal government was elected with a massive majority. It introduced a large number of social reforms. These included medical tests for pupils at schools and free treatment provided, 1907. Workers were compensated for injuries at work, 1906. In 1908 a pension of 5 shillings was introduced for those over 70. This reform was of great significance as it freed the pensioners from fear of the workhouse. In 1911 the government introduced the National Insurance Act that provided insurance for workers in time of sickness. Reform was 20 years behind Germany. Workers paid a 4-penny weekly premium. Unemployment benefit was introduced into certain industries, for example shipbuilding. A basic social welfare service had been created which greatly improved the conditions for poorer people in British society. To pay for this social reform the Liberals increased the taxes on the rich. These reforms were resisted by the Conservative-dominated House of Lords. The crisis caused by their rejection of the 1909 budget led to the Parliament Act that ended the veto of the House of Lords. Although still a powerful economic power, Britain had gone into relative decline against the new economies of Germany and the US. Table 1 The economy was growing very slowly although she continued to be the banking capital of the world. British shipbuilding boomed during the period, especially on the Clyde and in Belfast. Much of British industry had failed to modernise and many factories were slow to use electricity. For example, by 1910 German steel production was double that of Britain and US output of coal had overtaken and was greater than Britain. Traditionally the basis of British economic power had been based on free trade. As most of her competitors erected tariff barriers, Britain found her industries shut out from many markets. By the early 20th century the demand for tariffs increased in Britain. This demand was led by Joseph Chamberlain, who felt that protectionism would protect British industry and help to unite the empire. His demand was opposed by many in his own party and helped to split the once invincible Conservatives. This division paved the way for the Liberal victory in 1906.